Our speaker this evening, Drew Lanham, has always had a passion for birds. As a child growing up in rural Edgefield, South Carolina, he envied birds' ability to fly, and he tried to emulate them himself by floating away on a umbrella, resulting in a broken collarbone. In order to get a better view of a turkey vulture, he lay down in a field and played dead. He started his college career by studying engineering on a scholarship at Clemson University, but soon discovered that engineering was not for him, and he switched majors to follow his passion for birds. He received his PhD in forest resources wildlife in 1997. His research interests center on connecting the conservation dots, believing strongly that conservation must be a blending of heart and head. Drew uses birds and conservation issues surrounding the birds as inspirational vehicles to connect others to the outdoors and advocate for their protection. His investigations now involve ethnicity, especially African Americans, and how they relate to wildlife and other conservation issues. Drew is a uniter. The video of his 9 rules for the black bird watcher has gone viral. Among the rules are never wear a hoodie, ever. And if you are black and birding at night, be careful, as you might be perceived as up to no good. He says that when he meets another black birder, it's like encouraging an endangered species, an ivory-billed woodpecker. Extinction looms. Drew was awarded the 2020 Roland Alston Award for Excellence in Communication. His book, The Home Place, Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature, was named one of the best scholarly books of the decade by the Chronicle of Higher Education. A new and expanded edition of his book, Sparrow Envy, Field Guide to Sparrows and Lesser Beasts, is due to be released March 30th of this coming year. In one of his interviews, Drew described himself as, quote, a wild and wandering soul. We're honored to have you, Drew, as our speaker tonight.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you to Dave and to Peter for having me, and for all of you in the Denver Field Ornithological Society, for Denver Field Ornithologists, excuse me, for having me out there or having me here. It's sort of an odd time that we're in, right? And trying to figure out exactly where we are. I don't think the birds are having that problem as fall migration sort of nears an end and birds begin to settle into winter territory. I'd like to take the time that we are distant today in some way, as Bill said, to maybe try to bring us together as the flock that we are, Denver Field Ornithologists, birders, bird watchers, nature lovers, nature nurturers, all of us who are sort of here celebrating birds, celebrating life, celebrating the wonder of flight, the migratory miracles that birds present, the inspiration, the illumination, all that they present to and for us. As Bill said, I grew up envying birds, envying the flight of turkey vultures, what we used to call buzzards, of the azure beauty of blue jays flashing through the golden hickory leaves of autumn, of bobwhite quail flushing suddenly from an overgrown ditch. And even though I always knew where those coveys were, those birds always exciting me. And so birds became, for me as a child, a mechanism of freedom. They became a conduit of choice. They became a distraction of delight for me. And I will say that since my earliest years of bird watching that I can remember, probably 6, 7, or 8 years old, that now in my advanced state of double nickeling it at 55. I've watched birds all my life, and I will say that they still hold the same fascination for me. And so I like to say that everyone has a bird story. And in that, even if it's the chicken that you ate last night or the pigeon that pooped on your car, those are bird stories. And so birds hold a certain relevance for us all. For me, as a lifelong bird watcher, bird adorer, birder, ornithologist, now what was passion has become profession. And so I hope tonight in maybe sharing a story and maybe a few pointers that we can move ornithology, bird watching, birding, nature study, all of those things forward in a more united way. Because I think as long as human beings have watched birds, we've envied them for their abilities to slip the bounds that tied us to terra firma, that tied us to the ground. And so I'll share a story tonight of a birding incident, of sort of an adventure that I had, and hope that it illuminates for you both the joy and sort of the justice, as it were, that birds provide. The joy and the justice. So first, I'm going to confess. I've heard it's good for the soul to do this, so I'm going to confess I don't keep a life list anymore. It's been a long time, really, since I counted the number of species that I've seen or heard over the course of all these years. I've been all over the world, and I, in fact, live a life that's buoyed by birds. It's, again, both profession and passion for me. The fact is, though, I really can't tell you at this moment exactly how many birds are currently on my life list, my state list, my county list, my yard list, or my year list. Now, don't misunderstand me. I do understand the critical nature of citizen science for conservation. And so for 26 years, I was the compiler for the Clemson Christmas bird count. And I just retired from that post this year. And so even now, that's a list that I won't have to keep. And I am trying to become a better e-birder. But for the most part, there's now a lack of listing in my life. And so in this listless state of being, I've moved into a different mode of birding. Rather than identifying birds, I've actually decided that I'll spend as much time as I can identifying with birds. So in this confessing, I hope to invigorate my own passions for birding. I'm also hoping that this evolution of sorts helps me to see more clearly the bigger picture that blurring one's vision can bring. Now, like so many of you, I owe my life to birds in so many ways. And so while I no longer keep a list of the birds that I see, I can still recall each and every species that I've seen and where I saw it first, or perhaps most memorably. That's not just the visual memory that I have, but birds trip other sensory triggers for me, as I'm sure they do for you. Here in the low country, there's this sulfur stink of pluff mud and the beak clatter of a phalanx of wood storks and roseate spoonbills feeding in salt marsh. There's the short breath bite of high altitude and the sweet smell of ponderosa pine watching white-headed woodpeckers in eastern Oregon, or that breathlessness at high altitude where I saw white-tailed ptarmigan my first prairie falcon, brown-capped and gray-crowned rosy finches, water ouzels and Steller's jays, all of that in Rocky Mountain National Park. And so my life is better in those moments of solitude that I have with these birds. I don't just identify those birds, but I come to absorb those birds and to know them intimately. But even in those solitary moments and tons of personality testing that tell me I'm an introvert, it's those moments with people who feel about birds the way that I feel about birds that really stokes my passion. I've been all over the world. I've been to the Amazon, I've been to the Arctic, and in those travels, I've met people who impact me as deeply as the birds do. I have people to thank beyond the ideas for making many birdful events deeply memorable in the most soul-satisfying of ways. When we combine beautiful birds with kind, nature-loving human souls, it's a heavenly convergence, really. From the beginning of my birding obsession, I think about a friend in particular, Carl Montgomery, in third grade. So in third grade, Carl and I were these bird nerds who had discovered actually in second grade that we had this in common. We traded birder stories even then. It's hard to believe, but being a bird nerd isn't always easy. Being a black bird nerd sometimes can put you at odds of everything that any kid thinks is normal. That Carl Montgomery happened to be a white kid living in suburban Aiken, South Carolina, and I was a black country boy living in Edgefield, South Carolina. This was the impetus for an understanding, even at that early age, of how these differences of city versus country, of black versus white, in some ways could be overcome or at least appreciated because of birds. Carl would tell me about the painted buntings that he saw in his home place of Aiken, South Carolina, and in the upper coastal plain. And I would tell him about the scarlet tanagers I saw in my Piedmont home place. Now, Carl did forever one-up me when in the fifth grade, I think it was, he actually saw one of the early snowy owls of either of our birding careers. And so Carl has that one on me, but we were tick tight for years because of birds. In spite of our differences, we could always come together over birds. And so even now, all these years hence, I think about that experience of acceptance and exchange. It's an important lesson, I think, for us to carry forward. So come now to my current non-listing confession, and I realize that for all the birds that I've seen and loved, there's a list of people who've made this journey of feather fascination the joy of my life. After all the time in the field is done, the memories of the birds and birdful places remain. But the people I've met lie deep within too. My encounter with other birders out there and non-birders alike, those are overwhelmingly positive. However, my life as a black bird watcher, as a birder of color, is sometimes challenged. Most recently, there was this experience that I had with a farmer whose land harbors both a breeding pair of barn owls, as well as a sizable flock of wintering white-crowned sparrows. Now, I'll tell you, I've spent a lot of time on a public road next to this beautiful hedgerow watching these white white-crowned sparrows, this song, this plaintive song of white-crowned sparrows, this it is one of the most plaintively melancholic songs that there is, but it thrills me. And so I'm watching these birds in this hedgerow, totally absorbed, when the old farmer who owns the land on which these sparrows are finding haven approaches me and begins to recount the good old days of cotton farming, when niggers picked his cotton, his words, not mine. At this point, the sweet songs of the sparrows soured in this repeated revelation of this farmer who insisted on telling me that life was better when I was picking cotton, when my ancestors may have picked cotton in his fields. Now, oddly enough, just minutes before this encounter, I'd spoken with another birding friend of mine, George, who happens to be white, exchanging our observations of the morning and opining about the current state of affairs in the world, political and otherwise. But then we would come back to the birds that we'd seen. George and I tend to have these regular meetings out in this patch of pasture and woodlands and wetlands. It's an absolutely fabulous place to bird. I had only known George for about a year at the time, but birds made it seem our coming together over birds made it seem like I had known him for years. But in that encounter with the farmer, I had almost forgotten this positive encounter with my friend George. So I thought about this encounter with the farmer for a few weeks. In fact, I sat there and listened to for what seemed like a very long time, but it was probably only 5 minutes or so. And after I was essentially threatened by the farmer telling me that he was armed, I left and sat on the side of the road for a while and wrote the incident down. I was saddened in that moment because I'd probably spent hundreds of hours, yes, hundreds of hours cruising the fence lines in my pickup truck, watching the sparrows, hoping for loggerhead shrikes, watching kestrels hover into the wind. But this place was my sparrow spot. Along with white-crowned sparrows, there were vespers and white-throated and field and savanna song. And yes, even old world house sparrows were there. I'd sit and watch and listen, absorbing all this sparrowness. But that one encounter changed my range map. After that happened, I was displaced to what I saw as a safer place, initially looking for white-crowned sparrows, but then I ended up finding a loggerhead shrike in this new place, which I then began to obsess over and to absorb. As many of you know, loggerhead shrikes, at least in the Southeast, are a species in peril. And so while I left my white-crowned sparrows behind, there was yet another bird to salve my wounds. Now, birding calms me, as I'm sure it does many of you. No matter what transpires negatively in my life, things with feathers and wings lift me. And in the wake of this white-crowned sparrow affair, I turned intently to this loggerhead shrike. The word of a rare upstate South Carolina short-eared owl near the farmer's place drew me back to my Townville patch, but not to this farmer's particular piece of land. And as I was cruising through this patch one day looking for it, the possibilities rose as the day waned and the sun began to set in the shortened winter evening, and I was hopeful that this giant moth of a bird might emerge over the expanses of fields and pastures. I mean, of course, in those instances, every northern harrier sort of becomes a short-eared owl. As I rounded the first curve of my familiar circuit, McAdams to Dobbins to Royster Road, I saw my friends Imtiaz Haq and Linda Montgomery. They had their binoculars and their cameras in hand. At first, I thought maybe they had spotted the short-eared. As I do with George and other friends, we exchanged observations and soon came to the conversation about the farmer and my incident. Imtiaz Haq, who is of Iranian descent, apologized for me having to undergo that, and then told me, as president of the local bird club, that he had asked birders not to go to that site. It's not right, Imtiaz told me. He said, I won't go back there. The other birders who were gathered there at that time agreed. It was an act of solidarity and friendship from bird-loving kindred that I'm not sure I'd really expected. I mean, after all, this is the place to go and get your fill of white-crowned sparrows. It's the easiest, or was one of the easiest places to see barn owls. So, although the short-eared owl never showed itself, lots of other birds did, as I would stand in the company of good friends and we would talk about the incident, but we would also watch Canada geese and specks, greater white-fronted geese and Ross's geese and snow geese and pipitting flocks of pipits and song-tinkling horned larks and one or two Lapland longspurs. But more than the birds that we shared, more than any list we could compile, was this feeling of kinship and community that came from knowing that listing a barn owl or a white-crowned sparrow wasn't as important as doing the right thing by a friend. Now, my list of birding friends is expansive. Of nearly 5,000 friends on Facebook, I would say that probably 80% of those are nature-loving and bird-loving friends. I can count people in every state and many foreign countries around the world who share my passion, our passion for wild birds and wild places. Now, I've met a relatively small fraction of these thousands, but when I put this story out on social media, the responses were overwhelming, of people that I had never met, whose hands I had never shaken, or whose shoulders I had never hugged, who expressed deep care and concern for me. So that portal of friendship comes in large part because of birds. I, for now, at this moment, need that more than ever. And so I think there are things that we need to do to move forward in ways. We need to think not only about the birds, my friends, as we are out in quest now in these days, mostly solitarily, safely distanced. We have to think about our treatment of one another, as well as our treatment of the birds that we wish to conserve. So how do I see the wood thrush here in the East? How do I see the black and white warbler? How do I see the beautiful black and white plumage of a lark bunting? How do I see the black bird watcher in the park? How do I relate to my fellow human brothers and sisters who may look, love, or differently than me? we have to think about our common plights. We have to think about how to unite. And so I believe we have to turn inward to find relevance that becomes a basis for understanding how others, though different in skin color or gender, non-gender identity, how we might relate in ways that lead us towards some common cause of betterment. I think that is the ultimate convergence of these braided streams, if you will. That somehow we can gather around birds as my friends gathered around me to show me that listing me as a friend and as a human being was more important than listing a new bird. And so a challenge. I'd like for you to think tonight, as I've thought for most of my life, about yourselves as birds. I'd like for you to consider your range maps. I'd like for you to consider your social range maps. Just as we look in field guides or on our apps and we see the blue and the red and the purples of permanent residence or migratory patterns or winter residency, and we can understand where birds exist, and we can begin to delve into their lives and understand whether birds are just surviving or thriving. I want us to begin to think about how we expand our social range maps, how we expand what bird watching is, what birding is, that we begin to compile lists of different others that we know, that we begin to expand birding beyond the choir, that we begin to expand this whole idea of a conservation conversation beyond those who we've always talked to. There's a mantra that I love to use, and that mantra is same air, same water, same soil, same earth, same fate. We share that fate with the birds. We share that fate with one another. And so in our thinking, in our feeling, in our acting to conserve birds, that we certainly enjoy seeing the color and variance in behavior, that we do the same thing for our fellow human beings. I don't think we deserve any less. I imagine myself as a boy looking skyward at those red-tailed hawks, at those turkey vultures, of watching the blue jays steal my grandmother's pecans, of hearing those bobwhite quail regather after scattering, and all that birds have done for my life, and every bird that I can count that's made my life better, I can also count alongside those birds human beings who have seen me for who I am, who say that my Black life matters by the way that they treat me. And so I'm often asked the question of, well, but this is bird watching, this is birding. Why does race have to enter into it? Well, I've told you a story of how it has entered into it. You go back a couple of months and you can ask my friend Christian Cooper, as he was birding in Central Park, why it matters. And so it's time for us to put our list down for just a moment, to take our binoculars down for a moment, to have the wider view, to not only see the birds in front of us, but to see the human beings with who those birds share their ranges. For us to understand that it's important for us to consider our plights, that every time we meet someone, there's an opportunity for this mini social movement. I call them micro social movements. I call them micro protests. That instead of being the way maybe that you always were, maybe you become new in expanding your vision. Put down the high-powered, narrowly focused binoculars to see the same people all the time. Pick up some lower-powered, wider view binoculars that allow you to see the horizon and all the diversity of people that share this earth with the birds. Same air, same water, same soil, same earth, same fate. We share that with the birds. My friends Imtiaz and Linda and George and everyone else who approached me after that white-crowned sparrow incident recognized that. It meant everything to me to have that acceptance as a human being, not just as a bird lover. That Carl Montgomery, this kid, this white kid with whom I never discussed race, but we certainly saw we saw each other's color. We recognized these hues in birds. As different as a painted bunting is from a scarlet tanager, as different as a snowy owl is from an American crow, we recognize the differences in one another. And so that's my challenge to you, to think about listing in a different sort of way, to think about seeing color and hue and appreciating it and saying that that color does in fact matter. And in these ways, as we go forward, I think we can go forward in a new way. So I wanted to just give you a few pointers in going forward. And these are just some hints at a piece that will come out in Orion magazine, I think in a couple of weeks. These are 10 ways to protest racism bird by bird. First, again, take your binoculars down. Watch the whole without parsing it apart. Number 2, time travel. History is a hot spot. Birds can illuminate the mistakes of the past, blind spots in the now, and pitfalls that are coming to be avoided. Remember, extinction is an action word. Number 3, use your field guide. No, not field guide, but your field guide, F-E-E-L. Go with the gestalt. Don't be afraid to depart from known marks of distinction to make your own. Number 4, touch the third rail if you must. No, I'm not telling you to go and pick up clapper rails, king rails, Virginia rails, black rails, or any bird, but I'm asking you to take on the difficult conversation from time to time. Who we are affects how we see. Our prisms of the world are impacted by our identities. We must understand that. If you must do this, list the privileges that you have. Wandering without wondering who's watching with suspicion is something maybe that you haven't thought of. 6, go nowhere with assumptions. Don't make snap IDs on birds before you're certain. Likewise, do not do that with human beings. Be your own taxonomic committee if you must, is number 7. If a bird has been tagged with some racist or ne'er-do-well's name, I just simply rename the bird as I choose. I don't wait for the AOS. So for example, for a long time for me, Clark's nutcracker has been York's crow. Unless physically unable to do so, always see color. It's important. We do that with birds. We need to do it with human beings. I challenge you to tear down the monuments in your mind. Preconceived notions of who we are and our capacities are important as marble ones to tear down. And finally, listen just before dawn to the call notes of migratory birds flying overhead through stars and ink black skies. A wood thrush's shadow brown thirps in moonlight, a black and white warbler's chips to a wingmate seeking suitable landings below. Each of those birds has embedded in its brain a knowing of a better place that it needs to be, more so than where they are at the present time. Now, I ask you from time to time to sit and be still for a while. Listen to hear the struggles of those birds, but also of the prejudiced and oppressed who also seek security and thrival in much the same way as birds do. As a boy, I looked to birds for freedom and choice. We all seek better. We can change our range maps in how we behave and how we perceive. We can also change our range maps internally to make our hearts and minds safe stopovers for equity and peace for all people. Inclusion is a form of protest. I ask you to take your binoculars down, look in the mirror, and demand the inner progress. I am so grateful for Denver field ornithologists and all that you have offered in terms of a space for this singing from my perch here in South Carolina. Colorado is very special to me, as you may have heard, as I told my story. I will always remember my first time in Estes Park. And in fact, I rewrote Rocky Mountain High to fit me at the time. So I look forward to the opportunity to get back out there when it's safe to do so, and hopefully meet some of you, shake hands, give hugs, watch birds, and begin to compile my list of Colorado kindred. Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, everyone at DFO, for having me there tonight. And I look forward to the discussion and taking your questions. Thank you.
Are you on mute?
Okay, yeah, stop video. I'm okay. Thank you very much, Drew, for a most inspiring kind of talk and giving us a portion of your heart, which is so characteristic of all of your appearances, no matter how in whatever role you are, in terms of being a teacher, a researcher, reaching out as you've done with us, and author. It's just wonderful to have you. We've gotten a number of questions. One is, what can local Audubon chapters do to make people of color more a part of our operations? You've mentioned some of the things on an individual basis. How about in an institution, on an institutional level?
Well, I think the first thing I always suggest, Bill, is look at your mission statement. And, I've been on a lot of boards and spent a lot of time sitting around tables talking, trying to come up with solutions. And oftentimes when we think about an institution, we have to first go to the root of the institution. And the root of institution, just as the root of our country we see as the Constitution, the root of any institution is its mission statement. So look at your mission statement. I would offer, and again, looking at a mission statement is sort of like looking institutionally into a mirror. And once you're looking into this mirror, you begin to have some understanding of who it is that you are and where inclusion and diversity fit in that mission. Now, if they're not explicit within that mission, vision of your institution, then I think it's a little disingenuous to sort of go out without a plan and to sort of begin to harvest. It's almost going out like to harvest something without an understanding of what you're going to harvest. So look at your mission, look at your vision, and have some understanding. Look around your board table. And to the organization, to staff, to leadership, understand where everyone is. I've seen time and time again, organizationally, intentions to diversify and be inclusive when everyone wasn't on board, when major players weren't on board. And those major players who weren't on board acted to subvert efforts going forward. So you have to look internally first. Again, I'll use the metaphor of binoculars. Sometimes you have to take those binoculars down to actually see the bird. Many of us, you slam those binoculars up at some fast moving warbler in a tree and you don't get it until you take your binoculars down and then you see the entire context of the tree. And then you say, oh, there it is. Now I know how to put my glasses on it, how far away it is, what direction it's moving, and I can keep it in my field of view. So it's important that you be able institutionally to keep inclusion and diversity in your field of view. And that's intentional, because once you have that in your constitution, once you have it written, you have a guideline to go by. So that even as the board changes, as leadership changes, you have a constitution that says, you know what, this is what we believe in, and this is how we want to go forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, we're getting a lot of compliments on your talk. True. I have lots of questions too. There is a question. Was there any particular adult who influenced you as a young 7 or 8 year old interested in birding?
Wow. Bill, I'll have to go first to my grandmother. My grandmother was the first person I ever saw feed birds. And it wasn't black oil sunflower seeds. It wasn't Prozo. It was grits. And so she would take a handful of grits out of the bag and she would throw them out of her back door into the frost heaved ground for juncos and sparrows. And of course she called the juncos snowbirds, but she said she pitied the birds. And so that stuck with me. That stuck with me. And then some of her the prism through which she saw birds. Owls were bad omen. I mean, I do a lot of owl imitation. I'm frequently imitating barred owls, the whole Before I do that now, I sort of always ask my grandmother, because owls were bad omen. And that's something that she brought culturally with her from. So my grandmother was influential. Both my parents were science teachers. There were always books in the house. They subscribed to National Geographic. But I stayed in the bee encyclopedia. I mean, I memorized that bird section. But then I had a second grade teacher named Ms. Beasley, who passed out these mimeograph pictures of birds. And I remember the first bird that she ever passed out was a northern mockingbird. And my desk mate, Frances Williams, took out her crayons and colored this bird like a painted bunting. In second grade, I knew that a northern mockingbird needed to be subtly shaded with my big, fat, red #2 pencil. And so Miss Beasley recognized that. And when we would have library day, she introduced me to Ms. Wingo, yes, Miss Wingo, who then fostered this already sort of flaming, she threw fuel on this featherful fire and opened up the other side of the library to me, a second grader. So I got to go to the big kids side of the library. And I can remember the first field guide that I opened, and it was like rubbing a lamp. You open this book and all of these birds came out. And so at that point, I couldn't go back. I was thoroughly hooked. And I began in the second grade trying to earn money to buy a field guide and binoculars, 1 quarter at a time. So my parents, yes, my grandmother, but then Miss Beasley and Miss Wingo, who I need to try to find them if they're still alive and thank them, because by, again, accepting this passion in a kid, some kid who was either bound to be an ornithologist or awfully uncreative in seeing a mockingbird in those tones of gray, that the die was cast at that point.
Thank you. Also, someone has asked why you titled your book Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature, in contrast to referring to a more contemporary name for Black Americans.
Yes, because in one, I've always wanted that question. A little bit of it is an homage to my ancestors, to my parents, who fought hard, who marched in the civil rights movement, to move past all the pejoratives to be Black, to be recognized as such. And so it's a little bit of an homage, but it's also in recognition of all that I am. When I do my 23andMe and recognize all of the 80% of me that's Central and West African, that's Cameroon, Bamileke, and that is Mende, that is that core of me, but then the part of me that remainder, that roughly 20% that's Brit, German, Irish, Iberian, Southeast Asian, Native American, that this soil that my ancestors worked, the clay, the loam, all the leaves that have fallen on it, the cool water of the springs from which we drank, the muddy water of the creeks from which we fished, the cotton that my ancestors picked under bondage, the Black Angus cattle that they raised as free people, that all of that is me. And so I want people to understand my totality. I want them to understand that I'm proudly a Black man, but I also want them to understand the totality of me, that I won't be categorized as one thing.
Mm-hmm. I also had a person ask, have you maintained friends from your childhood and growing up, like Carl that you mentioned?
I saw Carl, now it's probably been about 10 or 12 years ago, and he came through. He was living in California, and he called, and we had an opportunity to sort of reconvene, to recommune, as it were. And so that was the last time that I saw him. But a number of friends, of people that now thinking of college as part of my childhood, it sort of tells you where I am on the age spectrum, but certainly of young adulthood, and those people who understood my passion for birds. I'm certainly still friends with many of them. Many of them are colleagues. Those people who saw me make that transition from engineering school to zoology and to become an ornithologist. I just gave a talk for my great mentor, Dr. Sid Gotro, last week. I am in constant conversation with Dr. Patricia Adair Gawadi, Patty Gawadi, the wonderful ecofeminist and ornithologist. So, man, I've, so many kindred spirits out there that that influenced me, but that are also dear friends. And so, yeah, I stay in touch with, we flock as frequently as we can.
That's great. Well, several people have commented how inspiring you've been, Drew, and inspired them to keep on the same efforts to lower the barriers to birding and other outdoor activities for people of color. Had a question, you probably get this all the time. What's your favorite bird?
Yes, I did. I get that one all the time. And so here's okay. My favorite bird is the one with feathers. Now, but I obsess over birds in different ways. Like I said, I absorb them during the quarantine because I wasn't getting out as much to look for migratory birds. I sat in my yard and I just became re-enthralled with rose-breasted grosbeaks and sort of watching them come through and watching their parrot-like behavior. But it's also sort of this lesson in inclusion and diversity, because the impetus oftentimes is to see a bird and say, okay, I've seen a rose-breasted grosbeak, or to count those rose-breasted grosbeaks as all sort of being the same. But I saw this wonderful, wonderful diversity in the males, for example, to see the differences in patterns of the bleeding heart, of the rose breast on that bird, to be able to recognize birds that stayed in my yard for almost 2 weeks. So rose-breasted grosbeaks were my spring fascination. I am forever in love with loggerhead shrikes because they are code switchers. They are both raptorial and passerine, and so I have something in common with that as a Black man, and having to sort of live these dual existences, and to be accepted for one thing and not accepted for another thing. And so I internalize birds that way. In this place that you see around me, in my thicket, as it's called a thicket in part because the bird that's most represented around me are bobwhite quail. My last count in this thicket, the covey is right around 60 birds. That's a super covey. I don't think I've ever seen one that large. Over my left shoulder there, I'm pointing at a great Lord God bird that is forever flying, hopefully towards some hope of not being extinct. So yeah, the one with feathers is my favorite bird.
Okay. Another question, how do you reach out to young people in schools, especially in inner city settings, to communicate the awe and wonder of the natural world?
Well, it's for me, it's a little hard in part because I'm a rural guy, right? And so I grew up far away from the city, but what we all have in common, in the way when I'm teaching sort of ecology, and I'll be doing this tomorrow morning, in fact, to young people, one of the ways that I do that, first, my wonder of flight. And so I don't dismiss pigeons. If you've ever watched a flock of pigeons fly, and watch how pigeons, as large-bodied birds, almost murmurate, how those flocks move in unison, how pigeons can tell you when a peregrine obviously is in the neighborhood, or how they act around a merlin. And so if I'm in a city, I don't walk past pigeons trying to find something exotic. I don't walk past starlings as we're talking about a city full of immigrants and the importance of the Statue of Liberty. And so I think that sort of that cliche of meeting people where they are, those pigeons, those peregrines that are hunting them in cities are flying through concrete canyons. To take someone birding in Central Park is an opportunity to talk about current events and some of the bad things that have happened, to talk about the migratory miracles, these evolved miracles of these warblers that have crossed the Gulf of Mexico nonstop so that we can see them, if we can think about it that way, but also an opportunity to blend in history, to help those kids who may be black or brown or white or red or any color, but to help them understand the history that Central Park wasn't always Central Park, that at one point that much of it was a community of Black people that was displaced. And so to tell that history, to wind all of that in, gives people stake, and it expands the conversation beyond birds, but that conversation comes through birds. So birds are our past, birds are our present, birds can be our future. We can study birds with rocket science. We can study birds. We can study the DNA of birds. We can study pandemics through wildlife, through zoonoses. So all of this is to say that birds, every bit of curriculum that I can think of can be taught with birds as a model. So I try to reach young people that way. But then I go back to the mantra: same air, same water, same soil, same earth, same fate. Understanding where our food comes from. Understanding that we all have to eat. Bird beings and human beings understand that we all need clean water, clean air. That gives us stake together. I mean, that was Rachel's message. So doing that, I think, sort of decouples, it allows kids to take their binoculars down. And I'll show you here. So you see these high-priced binoculars that I have here? These are high-priced binoculars that I guarantee are being generated millions of times a day in the United States right now. These are toilet paper tubes. Right? So this is one of the cool things that you can give kids to do. I would have given anything to have had my own pair of toilet paper tube binoculars when I was in the 2nd grade. So this is just sort of one of the tricks, pardon me, of the trade. But expanding birds so that people understand that everybody has a bird story.
Okay, and a question: have you encountered a birding organization or two anywhere in North America that sets a strong, positive example for inclusion and diversity? And if so, who are they and how did they come to be that example?
Okay, I've got two. We talked about this guy. I'm gonna call two people by name who to me are amazing ambassadors for bird watching and conservation. That is Ken and Kimberly Kaufman. So Black Swamp Bird Observatory in Ohio, and if you've ever been to the biggest week in American birding, you sort of know the spectacle that is. Right outside of Toledo. Spring migration there is just absolutely amazing. I mean, warblers within arm's reach. There you have to put your binoculars down because unless you can close focus on a black-throated green within 3 feet, you don't always need them. But Ken and Kimberly were some of the first people to really sort of open the doors of that festival Not that it was ever closed, but they were very intentional about wrapping their arms around me and other Black birders and birders of color. Mary Gustafson with the Rio Grande Valley Bird Festival. I mean, Mary Gustafson was so important in bringing several of us in, me and Dudley Edmondson and Douglas Gray, for example, bringing us in as guides in South Texas so that people could see us leading bird watchers. And so those are two organizations that have been extraordinarily forward. I was just off of a conversation last week with Alabama Audubon, who did Black Birders in the South, an hour and a half long, hard conversation about what it's like to be a Black birder in the South. Georgia Audubon, who just hired Corinna Newsom as a community coordinator, putting their money where their mouth is to expand birding. My friends in BirdNote in Seattle, who took the risk of producing 9 rules for the Black bird watcher. And that was a risk that they took. And so those are some examples of organizations and people by name. There are others out there, but people by name who are taking risks. And I'm being very sort of specific in mentioning Kim and Kimberly and Mary Gustafson as white people who took risks, who went to the level of sometimes losing friends and sponsors because they insisted on taking their binoculars down and seeing the larger field of view. So those are people that I think an awful lot of. My friends in Seattle, I think the world of, because they are really trying hard to stretch the stories so that those stories get the stories of others and tell those stories of people of color and other people out there watching birds, to tell the cultural stories of birds. So those are just some examples that I have. I can come up with more, but off the top of my balding head, that's sort of what I can come up with right now.
Interestingly enough, we had Ken Kaufman as our speaker in September on bird migration. And we have that, all your talks, we'll have your talk, Drew, archived on our website as we did with Ken's talk. So if people want to hear your talk again, or Ken's talk, or any of the other speakers we've had, they can just go to dfobirds.org and go under past programs and see videos of the programs. So
Bill, did I see that you guys are also having Robin Wall Kimmerer?
Yes, that was on on one of our announcements. Yes.
So again, what you're doing and being intentional about, and I love Robin Wall Kimmerer and her work and her voice for Indigenous peoples, and that means a lot. And so you have to be intentional about these efforts. And what you're doing is being intentional. And I tell people, you have to be intentional. Again, it becomes part of your mission. And it's like a mantra. And as you recite that mantra, you believe it. And you begin to not just believe it, but you begin to live it. So same air, same water, same soil, same earth, same fate. And understanding that sharing, that's important. Birdwise these days, I'm saying evening grosbeak, evening grosbeak, evening grosbeak, hoping that they will come as winter complement to my rose-breasted grosbeaks.
Robin's program is going to be, it's not a DFO program, but it's by one of our collaborators, and that's the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History. And at the end of our talk, we'll have more on more announcements of those programs
Awesome.
by the Book Bar as well as the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History.
Might I also mention, Bill, that the lark bunting that you have as your DFO logo, that bird says a lot to me. It's one of the birds that I look at as a symbol. So we know the lark bunting by its plumage, correct? I mean, we see that bird as a black and white bird. We see that bird as I see that bird as a sort of unity bird. So it's an appropriate symbol, I think, for our conversation tonight.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've seen that some of your favorite birds are ones that have black in the name or are black birds.
Oh,
like
yeah.
Crows and ravens and on.
Certainly.
Yeah. That's great. Also had a question about when did you become a writer?
Wow.
I realized that you had a flair for poetry.
I started writing The Home Place, I think, when I was 19. I was actually, there was a quiet moment during an engineering internship, and I wrote maybe a paragraph, but I drew a picture of a pine tree that I remembered. And that pine tree that I drew actually was the pine tree where an eastern kingbird used to nest. And I remember that eastern kingbird, my grandmother called them bee martins, but that eastern kingbird would always dive at my head. But I wrote my first inkling of writing probably when I was about 20, and then I didn't write again for another 20 years, except for peer-reviewed scientific articles. And then, there were a couple of sonnets here and there for girlfriends. But then when I was 40, I had just gotten tenure, and I was looking for a way to not have students despair about all the bad news of conservation. I wanted to not only inform them, but I wanted to inspire them to do something, to act, and not just to sort of wallow in all the bad news of extinction and fragmentation and climate change. That to love something is to want to save it, to conserve it. And it's easier to love things through beauty than it is through despair. And so that's where the writing began for me.
Mm-hmm. Another question, what was the role of organizations on your path?
Wow. In part, I've never been a huge joiner, but the organizations that probably sort of brought me to this place of talking about conservation in the way that I do was the South Carolina Wildlife Federation, where I developed a birding program called Palmetto Pro Birders, in fact, and they gave me an opportunity there to develop this sort of a la carte birding program that classes would fill almost immediately. But this whole idea of the organization expanding to use birds as a conduit was important. So that organization was important. Audubon, South Carolina is the second organization where I served on the board, and Norn Brunswig and Sharon Richardson were two of those leaders who sort of gave me in ways the keys to driving this conservation mission. The Aldo Leopold Foundation in Wisconsin, an amazing organization on which I served, but that carries forward Leopold's mission and vision of conservation being a state of harmony between people and land, and of course, BirdNote.
Great. Let me see. Oh, we've gotten so many, it's difficult to pick out some. We talked about your favorite bird. A number of people have commented about Ken Kaufman and your relationship and your admiration of him. Somebody writes in, "Yay, Ohio." A lot of people been there for the best week in birding up at the
It's
Lake,
amazing.
up at Lake Erie there. What are some of your favorite areas to bird near your home? I know you're big on South Carolina and the your love of place and having us realize what treasures all of our where we come from and our
Well, you know, Bill, South Carolina is a relatively small state, but I'll give you a, you know, sort of as a final nugget, I'll give you a trip from the mountains to the sea. So we can start out at breakfast in on Sassafras Mountain on a spring day, and we can watch broad-winged hawks streaming in. We can see breeding peregrine falcons. We can see breeding ravens. We can hear ruffed grouse. If we go a little bit west into Jocassee, we can hear cerulean warblers. This is all before noon. We're going to head down to the Midlands, and so from Caesar's Head, Sassafras, Table Rock, we're going to head to the Midlands, and we're going to head down to Congaree National Park. And in Congaree National Park, we'll have the opportunity to hear Swainson's warblers. Perhaps we'll see Mississippi kites, but not far from there, in Sandhills, we'll have the opportunity to see red cockaded woodpeckers and to hear Bachman's sparrows. We can have a lunch barbecue in the Midlands because that's where barbecue starts to get good in South Carolina. Then we're going to move to the coast for dinner. We're going to go down into the Ace Basin, but on the way, we're going to stop and we're going to go into Audubon Beidler Swamp, and we're going to see more prothonotary warblers than you've probably ever seen. We're also going to get to hug a 1,500-year-old tree. We're going to make that quick stop. We're going to then go into the Ace Basin, and we're going to cross the Combahee River, and we're going to cross the point where Harriet Tubman made her furthest excursion south to liberate over 700 enslaved people. We're going to go into Nemours Wildlife Foundation, and we're going to see wood storks and roseate spoonbills. And oh, we're going to look up and we're going to see soaring swallowtail kites above us. We're likely to see white pelicans. And that night at our oyster roast and low country boil with shrimp caught fresh out of the creek by my friend Bo Bauer, we are going to go to a managed impoundment, an old wetland that enslaved peoples created, and we're going to listen for black rails because they're there. That's in a day in South Carolina.
Oh, Drew, you're a wonderful ambassador for South Carolina and nature generally. How nice. Thank you so much for being with us tonight and giving us such a insightful and inspiring kind of a talk. We so appreciate you coming and sharing your thoughts with us. It's the accolades and compliments and real joy that people have found in your talk are just overwhelming, really. So thank you so much for coming in, Drew. It's been wonderful to have you, and we look forward to the new and expanded edition of your book, as well as the home place and any other forthcoming books that you're going to be writing.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you, Dave, and thank you to Denver Field Ornithologists for having me in tonight. Please stay safe, be well, and watch the birds and list them in your heart.